Okay, we're getting started. Good afternoon. While you're all sitting down, I'll just briefly say, obviously, a good time to turn off your cell phones. We have deaf interpreters here, sign language interpreters here, who are interpreting for our live stream audience and for anyone here who might want them to. I also just wanted to say this is the Hen House Literary Center. If any of you wanted to use this space for anything, for a meeting, for an event of any kind, feel free to be in touch with us. We will be doing space rentals throughout the year. Feel free to be in touch with Monica Fernandez, who's our media director right there, or myself, and we'll try to work with you. I also want to say that on May 18th, we'll be having an event with Richard Blanco, recently recipient of the National Medal of Honor from the National Humanities from Joe Biden himself. And he's already been to the White House, of course, as the inaugural poet for Obama. So like Forrest Gump, he just keeps going to the White House. And he'll be reading with C. Bain, who's a Red Hen poet. So we're very excited about the two of them. And that is May 18th at 6:30, so it's on a Thursday in the evening. So we hope you'll come back for that. Other than that, I don't think I have any other announcements. Thank you all so much for coming. We will be selling books afterward. And I wanted to mention that today's moderator is Francisco Aragón, who is the author of this amazing book, After We've Been. This came out during the pandemic, but it was very well received. There was a lot of excitement about this book, and we're so glad that Francisco Aragón is going to be here today moderating this event. Please welcome him. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon. As Kate said, my name is Francisco Aragón, and I direct Letras Latinas, which is the literary initiative at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies, which was established, Letras Latinas was, in 2004. In fact, next year, 2024, we will be celebrating our 20th anniversary. The close and enduring ties between Letras Latinas and Red Hen Press were forged in Guadalajara, Mexico, at the book fair there in November of 2009. And so it's a pleasure to have a hand in this afternoon's collaborative event featuring two poets, one whose work I've known and admired for over 20 years, and another whose work I've immersed myself in for the first time these last several days. What I'd like to do right now is offer a brief introduction of our two poets and then share one piece of my own to launch the poetry portion of our time together. And after our two featured poets read, I'll pose a couple of questions before I ask each of them to do something special, poetry related, and then we'll open up questions and conversation with all of you, the audience. Our first poet's biographical sketch in her latest book begins like this. Phuong Thi Vuong cannot stop thinking about language, memory, and migration. After spending the last few days immersed in the 56 pieces that make up A Plucked Zither, her second book, I wholeheartedly echo not so much the content of that statement, but the order in which those three subjects are articulated. In other words, I consider myself partial towards the how over the what. Put another way, as much as I share a deep interest in and empathy for the subjects of memory and migration, when it comes to considering what I derive from someone's literary practice, I echo Chicano poet Eduardo C. Corral when he states in an interview, language is queen. All throughout the pages of her award-winning collection, I relished and enjoyed what I'll call her linguistic laboratory. This became evident in the poet's willingness to bring into play a plurality of languages, but also an exploration and experimentation with both format and form. But please don't misunderstand me, lest one thinks I'm describing a so-called language poet. I am not. Despite what I've just said, storytelling and subject matter do matter in her work. The poetry in A Plucked Zither, winner of Red Hen Press's Benjamin Saltman Award, is a moving alchemy of all of these things. You will see and experience for yourself what I mean when you hear her poems. In the summer of 2004, I was putting together a book proposal for the University of Arizona Press for an anthology that went on to become The Wind Shifts, New Latino Poetry. Part of my method was exploring existing anthologies, and one of those was a co-edited volume called Between the Heart and the Land, Latina Poets from the Midwest, which had been put out by Carlos Cumpian's March Abrazo Press in Chicago. It was in that gathering of poems where I first encountered Brenda Cárdenas, who was the co-editor of the volume. In addition to inviting her to contribute to The Wind Shifts, we subsequently collaborated on From the Tongues of Brick and Stone, which was published by my venture into chapbook publishing, Momotombo Press. And after that, we joined efforts again in publishing Boomerang with Bilingual Press in the Canto Cosas series I edited for them. And now her latest collection, Trace, which is a publishing collaborative between Letras Latinas and Red Hen Press. In short, Brenda and I have a long, enriching, and meaningful history. Let me close this moment, this modest gesture, with words of the former Poet Laureate of Santa Barbara, Emma Trellis. Quote, "To read the poems in Trace is to journey through tierra, myth, wound, and love." Before I invite the first of our featured readers, I was asked to share something of my own, which I appreciate since I am also a fellow practitioner. One of the most consequential experiences in my life was living and traveling in Spain for 10 years, with brief stints in France, England, Ireland, and Italy. This would have been the late 1980s and the better part of the 1990s. The piece I'd like to share is titled To the Old World. And it appears in my Red Hen volume, After the Ban, which, as Kate mentioned, came out in 2020 during the pandemic. It's a curious poem in that it's a collage or alchemy of sorts, weaving together disparate lines of poetry from 3 sources. My first book from 2005, Huerta del Sol, the translated lines of poetry from the French poet Apollinaire, and translated lines of poetry from the Swiss-born novelist and poet Blaise Cendrars. To the Old World. Days I walked around swaths of you, whose names slip my mind. I'm thirsty, come to me, flowing down my throat. Billboards, posters, door plates twittering like parakeets. Through heaven came flying 1,000 pigeons. I strode alone through your crowds, buses in herds rolling by. I stood at the counters of your dirty bars. I ate in your restaurants at night, often at long tables, sharing a bottle of wine. Most mornings, a milkman clinked glass along a lane. In the perpetual screeching of wheels, I heard a song, and my ears, like taillights, trail behind to hear it still. The great hearth of you, with the intersecting embers of your streets, your old buildings leaning over them for warmth. And beneath, I rubbed elbows with your shuddering metros, some of them bellowing like bulls. The cry of their whistles could tear me apart. The skies above your plazas would turn deepening shades of violet, and your waves of traffic, footsteps, and the smell already of chestnuts roasting in a barrel on a corner. Your parks were lungs, your air crisp enough to taste, sprinkled with sputtering Vespas and horns. Your newly scrubbed neoclassic facades I loved looking at. And faces glanced or gazed at, waiting for the light to change. Once, not sidewalks, but one wide walk, cars streaming up and down both sides of it, with pavilions on my right and left, newsagents, florists, pet merchants and their chirping cages, or descending stairs for a stroll behind a clear, blue, thundering sheet of water. And let me remember well the white-haired man descending ahead of us off the plain. How something in me fluttered, hearing his vowels, hearing in the sound of his voice a message I'd take years to unravel as I venture to inhabit once again your cities, myself. Please join me in welcoming our next poet, Phuong Vuong.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you so much for that introduction. I've been enjoying hearing people talk about my work, not to tell me it's good or anything, but especially because I think it's really nice to make me think more and more deeply about my own work. Thank you, Red Hat Press, for being here on a Saturday, for planning and hosting this. It really means a lot. I'm also going to shout out our ASL interpreters, because when you work with multiple languages, it really makes you think about how they're going to interpret this. So I appreciate them and all their preparation too. I'll try to keep my comments short, because I know we'll talk more after. So I'll start with the first poem in the book, Country of Origin, after Safia Ampilo. Country, from Latin roots meaning against, opposite, and land, line, opposite, Oxford English Dictionary. Vietnamese word nuoc means water. Vietnamese word nuoc means country. Cháu sống ở nước nào? Child, which country do you live in? Child, which waters do you live in? An ocean is a stream of water, water you float in, the country you belong to, salts and tans you, marks citizen, brown, glow. If water equals country and water feeds lives, you survive on country. Therefore, water is requisite for country. Therefore, water makes country. But here, a country lies opposite from me, a country opposite an ocean. So country opposite water, a homeland opposite water, a homeland lying opposite from water is my country. In what nook does that leave me? So I chose a few poems thinking about reading with Brenda, knowing that she also thinks about all the different people that kind of exist in cities. So I have a few that I'm hoping to be in conversation with her. This is the dream. In the sun, brown men glow as I hear the clop of their hammers. They nail new siding to a building, staple tar paper to a roof, whack weeds off the edge of a yard. Always these men of soil and gasoline bring me to my father, a different brown, but brown. I picture him standing with his friend by the railroad tracks, the construction store, a food truck. They wait to be picked up, to labor the day, forever a bit unsure if the cash will come from the hands that work them. Years later, opening Dan's gardening, Dad and I would walk rich neighborhoods with their tall bushes, leafy maples, and so much lawn. Flyer, roll blue sheets into handrails, or slip them under welcome mats. I imagine Dad would drive by Home Depot, point to a few men he didn't know. Then all of them, with English unsteady on their tongues, would arrive somewhere they didn't know. There, they would bow over rakes, uncertain about the day's earning. Here, I sweat in the summer heat, wonder if this is the American dream, for my Vietnamese father to fight alongside some in a war abandoned. And when they decide to allow entrance, he earns the right to cut their grass, build their homes, reiterate hierarchy and hire. Am I welcome to make anew? Migrant child says, let me see the lineage that leads to some soil, womb skin, guava seed, rice field, buffalo with. She becomes new, of ready mouth and concrete name, says, I too am the pulse of basketball on blacktop after school's out, clean white shoes and a lineup. This country and thus we, made of black hands. I know Oakland neighborhoods not listed on maps. Dubs, Funktown, Ghost Town, Deep East, Seminary. Like the hands that claim these streets theirs, another blood runs rivers through me. Delta-colored and city fortress, as newcomer, as faulted. I've belonged to the music of cars touching bumpers and the men outside smoking. A breeze, the breeze, a respite from dinner. Porch culture, lean against the wall culture. Have a cigarette, do your hair and nails salon culture. And from all this, these places, synthesis of differences, contradictions that agitate me, pull at my skin, make warm party a ruptured blush. Nyo. My father would doubtless ask about weather, and I would not tell him how. Air reminds me of Vietnam, my missing, our silence, galactic weight to bear alone. All of us tense as the word love, a family that reveals might crack, or just him. So I owe it to knuckle tight, think where and way the sidewalk can split, and I swim against the reaching dreams of plumbing and steel. Blue as a scarf, I feed my own mouth, as sure as sad. While we keep treading water, how I feel tonight, in a plucked zither, as rain sheets us. I rarely get to read the poem where the title comes from, so it's a treat to put that in. So I'm going to read 3 more poems, and they're all thinking about communicating across distance. And Francisco mentioned playing with forms and format, and that's partly where it comes from, is to try to make the reader think about how we always already stretch across different languages and space. So the poem I'm going to read, if you can see it, it's formatted into 3 columns, and the poem can be read horizontally or vertically. So I'm going to read it in that order. So you'll hear it twice. Transposed in traffic. A scooter idles, hollow tut-tut, pulls me aside. The sound of hovering, singing ready to swing into a world, pictured carving through asphalt sea, split by yellow glint like an eel's tail. Weave of red light, cutting the traffic mass, undulate to evening. Bikes dodging blockade, the slow plug of humans. Life ekes by, a dribble. There I was, but no, I was not. Not there, but in a picture, rectangle slot moment. Not there, not fully. Crisp frame of once, dissociative reaction, body a split screen. Then I'm there, memory flip switch, slide me in. Vertically. A scooter idles, the sound of hovering, picture it carving like an eel's tail, undulate to evening, life ekes by, not there, but in a picture, crisp frame of once. Then I'm there, hollow tut-tut, singing ready through asphalt sea, weave of red light, bikes dodging blockade, a dribble. There I was, rectangle slot moment, dissociative reaction, memory flip switch, pulls me aside, to swing into a world, split by yellow glint, cutting the traffic mass, the slow plug of humans. But no, I was not there, not fully, body, a split screen, slide me in. I'm gonna try to read this second to last one slowly, but it's kind of meant for speed. Thinking again about dissociation or moving through memory. In the canals of thought, the mass of wires, birds' nests of cables, power lines above me in Colorado, some gray alley, gray building behind a tea house, a creek, a two-lane boulevard as American as ash trees deep in August's frayed feathers, where thick black ropes, vines, branches, like rubber electric tunnels stretch taut across air, the mess floating by someone's balcony, 3 floors up in apartment space to beat the summer heat. Like suddenly I'm looking up in Saigon, Hue, somewhere in a balmy alley, white underwear on hangers, drying by electric transformer, and I overhear the neighbors chat, sitting on short plastic stools, sniffing between chili snot and noodle slurps, the basil and beef hanging in humidity, telltale signs of any dense place, its animal tangle, smells, and sidewalk denseness, man-made, sky-high knots, tight ropes for currents. Under there I stand and I look, and I am teleporting, time-tripping child of electric vision. Thanks for grunted in appreciation. Okay, I'll close with this one. A repeating distance. I'm far from my mother, the distance won't end soon. My mother is far from her mother, the distance started long ago. We advance away, each generation replicates journey. What rhymes with opportunity? Each tests the tether of ties to what came before, what it means to come from, away from a mother. How many years will undo my making? How many to make me lose her, to lose an origin, to change my reply? Where are you from? I'll be asked again and again, and my mouth dries, pulled thin, brittle from distance. My smile splinters. If I repeat an answer, will its meaning change? Will my mouth bleed? Will that blood remind me who I am from? Will it rest my body in their long gone ashes? Does a question fail? Is an answer too simple?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Red Hen for this. I will be forever grateful. And to Letras Latinas and the Institute for Latino Studies. Thank you to our ASL interpreters. And it's such a delight and an honor to read with Vuong. I was privileged to read the book before flying out here, and I just love it and agree with Francisco about the way that you spin and turn language. Just blew me away. So thank you for that reading. I'm going to begin with an ekphrastic poem, which is a poem written in conversation with or in correspondence with a work of art. There are a number of ekphrastic poems in this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, in this book, and I've loved visual art for a long time, and so I've been writing poems that correspond with visual pieces for a while, but Francisco and the Institute for Latino Studies did an incredible program at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., when there was a huge art exhibit of Latinx art. And it was called Our America, the Latino presence in American art. And I was lucky enough to be able to co-teach a master workshop there with Valerie Martinez, the poet Valerie Martinez. So some of the poems came out of that. This poem is after a drawing by the Mexican artist Eric Ricardo de Luna Genel. And there's a number of poems in the book after his drawings. 100 nombres para la muerte, 100 names for death. And he has it's a loteria deck actually with depictions, many different depictions of death. She has a different name every time. And in this poem, it's La Hilacha, or the loose thread. And so the skeleton is at a loom weaving, and the cloth she's weaving has little skeletons on it. And there's a moon hanging over her. And I will be referencing a Mayan mythological person or personage, what have you, called Ixchel. And Ixchel in Mayan cosmology is the goddess of the moon, of water, of weaving, and of childbirth, who set the world in motion. In her dark aspects, she's depicted as a crone wearing a skirt with crossed bones and carrying a serpent and a jug of water. So with that, 100 nombres para la muerte, la hilacha, the loose thread. Ixchel, skeleton moon at her loom, wipes her furrowed forehead, daddy long legs dangling like loose threads from the corners of her eyes, dark as ditches. She stitches crossbones into skirts, weaves skulls into blankets she will trade with travelers. Mantillas rebosos she'll sing, unfurling her wares for parents to wrap around babes she has guided from their mother's oceans to earth. Under one moon, a Salvadoran father and mother cannot wait any longer in the winding lines of starved asylum seekers ordered to halt. So their daughter, not yet 2, wraps her tiny arms around the bow of Papi's neck, clings to his trunk as he wades into the big river, swims strong as salmon against churning currents. But when he spills her on the bank, warns her to wait, and lunges back into the torrent for mommy, the little one panics, follows. Under one sun, the river carries them away, defying the border it never meant to become. Ixchel's waning crescent finds them first, face down in the mud, wrapped together in the black shroud of Papi's shirt. And from her great jug, holding all the waters of heaven, she spills storms to wash away the lines we've carved, dug, drilled, the walls we've built in chain link, barbed wire, concrete and steel, between desert and desert, river and river, earth and earth, between father and mother, mother and child, under one moon. And that poem is for Oscar Roberto Martinez Ramirez and his daughter Valeria. You may have seen the photographs in the paper when they died trying to cross the Rio Grande. This poem is lighter, much lighter, and it's just called Ofrenda de Otoño, fall or autumn offering. A flurry of chickadees unfurls from birch trees as red fox loiter in a commune of sunflowers. Zorro scratching chill seeds, free fall of food we will squirrel away for the months when snow crags climb to garage roofs. Also gather your ripe berries. Venado, your red maple leaves. Murciélago, your mosquitoes. Chapulín, your tiny violins. A traffic of bitter winds, y carambanos are knocking at our doors. I offer you this mocalgete de cominos, crushed cloves y coraje, chile ancho, hechizo de bruja. This stone has hissed like a radiator, crackled like a hearth, smoked like a shell of sweetgrass, una benedicción. And I am from Wisconsin, so that is why I have snow to the garage roofs in some of my poems. Next, I'd like to read. This is another ekphrastic poem, and I felt that I really had to read this one because it's after a work of art by a Los Angeles artist, Ches Bojorquez, and it's after his piece called Placa, Roll Call. And this is a piece of graffiti art in which the graffiti looks incredibly glyphic. And it begins with an epigraph by the artist who said, if the city was a body, graffiti would tell us where it hurts. And this block would shout, "Nos diste un chingazo, cabrón. Mira esta cara rota, these baton cracked ribs, this black and blue street dizzy con gente, Blades, Kiki, Larry, Snow, Enrique, Connie, Elton John, David Kelly, Jeff Raton, Chaz. Los de aquí, los de abajo." This roll call won't be silenced, not by Glock, not by chokehold. This, our temple of runes, our tomb, its glyphic curve and flow, calligraphic code writ acrylic. This, our relic, our scroll unrolled in catacombs, our flecks of subtext still buzzing después de que vayamos con la pelona. Que lucha loco, ven, baila con nosotros to the aerosols, maraca y hiss. Al punk in Español's furious sweat. Hang your head out the window y dale un grito tan lleno de duende that it cracks the pavement. Summons our dead to dinner. Turn the tonal kaleidoscope. Then pause, catch your breath, so you don't miss the illegible moment where all the mystery lives. There, decipher that. Yeah. Love his work. I'm going to go to two poems now that are from the end of this book, and the end of this book has a number of poems that are about aging, right? Being middle-aged, and they come out of dream. So it's that mix of, you know, what it's like when you start to get older, you walk past the mirror, and it's like, who the hell is that? So these come out of that and out of dream. And this is called Middle-Aged Dreams. So that old lover, the one I didn't remember when I ran into him at a book fair 10 years after we ate strawberries off each other's skin in a steamy tent erected on the sandy banks of a river. The one who approached me all smiles as if we had eaten those strawberries yesterday while I cast blank eyes because I thought he might be the long-lost friend I had dropped acid with in a house where fish swam around fork and spoon, dipped in and out of coffee cup because, you know, all aquariums are tables set for breakfast. Not that one, but the one who left me driveling in puddles while he drifted across country to join a Buddhist monastery. Yes, that old lover shows up at 4 a.m. I've already married him twice, the second wedding only months before, and now he's leaving me again. I'm standing in a puddle that floods the valley, no, the truck route. Screw all this pastoral shit and admit it. You live on a truck route, about to marry a man I've never seen in my life, nor whose fruit I ever want to lick. When I try to shake out the cobwebs and dry my feet on fresh sheets, I tell husband about it. But all he can say is, where was I? You mean I wasn't even present on our truck route? And the dog purr growls, which means she must go out. Subtraction and addition. A night minus husband equals deep sleep, where you dream about husband doing things he would never do. Leave you in a corner so he can party with celebrities on a barge out to sea. Meanwhile, you've accumulated a third brother who is aware of your and his departed sibling, but won't utter aloud that family minus brother equals hole in the bottom of the ship. He laughs when you ask him to paddle you to husband, who holds a glass of bourbon up to the moon and howls while spinning like Michael Jackson, something husband would never do. You minus words equals empty space equals panic, stuck screen, gumped vocal cords. Yes, a woman can shoot blanks, turn into a red balloon that loudly farts its way into a thicket of shame. Why you, mute bubble? You've always been smitten with the mutable. Clownfish, chameleon, seahorse, selkie, ice cube. You should be the trumpeter that calls them all home. And I'm going to end on a poem that is a collage poem. All of the language in this poem, except for a few ands and buts and ors, come from other poets, and they are all poets whose books were taken out of the Tucson public schools, out of the classrooms under that district's 2010 law, HB 2281. that virtually banned those texts. And it's been since overturned, thank goodness, but for a while those books were blocked from the classrooms. And so I decided it was my duty to write a poem that used language only from those books. So this is called Because We Come From Everything. Because we come from everything, from zero, from a doubt slender as a hair, from a land of travelers, wanderers, and its geography of scars, from frayed edges and muddy hems, from the border sealed tight as an envelope, Meskin-Dixon line. Because we come from Operation Wetback, Operation Peter Pan, Operation Gatekeeper, floodlights, sensors, infrared spy videos, night vision cameras, topo maps, helicopters, and holding cells, from sharpshooting goose steppers round every corner, from alien gods and alien names and alien eyes and wild alien tongues, from the barbed wire politics of stupidity. Because we come from the ship that will never dock, from a parallel universe, double helix, synchronized psi, the infinite division del secreto terrible, the screaming sun. Because we come from steel mill smoke and silt slaughtering the sky, a matchbox house beneath the shadow of the freeway, windows so small you'd think they were holding their breath, and roaches so big they looked Pleistocene, kids hopscotching on the sidewalk, and a dusty, unpaved road called Sal, si puedes. Because we come from the geometry of disaster, schools torn down and sold for scrap, bristled restrictions and Chuco hieroglyphics, the gash sewn back into a snarl, crushed cigarette in a glass. Because we come from linoleum and formica, from rooms boarded shut and rented to strangers in una esquina aparte de los demás. Hole in the ceiling, kids on milk crates, the hammerhead of responsibility, tin plate face down on the floor. We come from brujas, chavalas, carnales, cabrones, rucas, locas, comadres, los vatos, los perros y los perdidos. Una vieja y sus recuerdos, eternal ciphers with voices bright as chrome. Because we come from every cell, every follicle, every nerve, the petals of the body, an orchid of blood, mapped birthmarks, knowing and unknowing. Because we come from museums and waiting rooms, hostile territory and collateral damage. Because we come from the out-of-service area, from another bad dream, a bowl of beans. Because we come from El Rascuache, Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent, Santeria Tupperware party, magnet car statuettes and calendar art at the flea market, La Segunda, from the word cachivaches and la loteria, a world loaded on each back. Because we come from everything on top of everything, from unbending dreams and a long line of eloquent illiterates, the throat that must clear itself and apologize each time it speaks, a sound like swallowing mud. Because we come from el camino de la mestiza, the path of red and black ink, from linguistic terrorism and literary archaeologists, from each of the stars' stories. Because we come from a green flutter, the hummingbird's throat, a chorus resounding for acres. Because we come from dichos, cantos, cuentos, from the spoken word, the seed of love in the darkness. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So now for the second portion of our program. I'm going to start by asking one question that I'd like both of you to address. One encounters in both trace and a plucked zither what I'll call a plurality of languages beyond the English language. Spanish, in your case, Brenda, and the language spoken, I assume, in Vietnam. In your wonderful. Could each of you offer us a thumbnail portrait of your respective trajectories with these languages and how and why they came to play a significant role in at least one strand of your work?
Okay, I'm definitely gonna be thinking as I speak. Thank you for that question. So yeah, the poems use Vietnamese. So I was telling Francisco earlier before the event that my family came to the US when I was 4, and so Vietnamese is my first language, but it also doesn't function in my life as my first language. I probably speak, read, and write in English best, and then my Spanish is better than my Vietnamese, and I can talk about lunch in Vietnamese. So in some ways, writing in Vietnamese is an exploration to uncover some of the things that I've lost, or what other possibilities could exist. So it means going back to the dictionary. It means thinking about words and what feelings they have. I know that might sound strange. Hopefully, it's like associative thinking. Yeah, some people are nodding. So yeah, because I think words, when we grow up with them, even if we don't know the explicit definition, we know that they carry some sort of meaning, or we can guess at the meaning. And so I think sometimes I'm writing poems trying to think about that emotional element. Yeah. The other thing too is I've been thinking about audiences and like, who do we leave out and who do we choose to invite in? And I think using Vietnamese is also a way to engage in that kind of politics. So sometimes I want to speak to a Vietnamese or Vietnamese American audience. And there's a poem that says kind of like, I don't want to tell you. And so, trying to just complicate the work of representation, which obviously writers are interested in telling our stories, but also knowing that that's complicated because sometimes that can be exploited or taken out of context. So yeah, trying to engage in all these different ways. So those are some of the thoughts I have in terms of working with Vietnamese.
And for me, I feel like my first language was more Spanglish, or the mixing of the two languages. I heard Spanish in my home, and I also heard, we lived in a multi-family home when I was growing up, and my Mexican aunt married a man from Yugoslavia, right, who owned the home, and then my little nuclear family lived upstairs, and my grandparents were right across the park. I mean, we were all right there. And so I would like mimic them when I was little. And so I would hear my Slovenian uncle and I'd be like, I want to go to there. And then, I'd be this, my auntie the next minute would be, I would fall and she'd be, sana, right? So I kind of heard it all, right? And so mixing languages, for me, was just like the way, it was just natural, right? And I also, but for me, when I do this in poetry, it's partly that, right? And it's partly a way to honor, the Spanish that has been in this country longer than English. But it's also, for me, it's also a matter of craft, because I'm interested in how the sounds of one language rub up against the sounds of another language. And I'm always really excited when I get like an interlingual rhyme, right? Or interlingual alliteration that I wouldn't get if I was in only one or the other. So that's part of it too.
Thank you. So question 2 and 3 are for each of you. Let me pose them and then ask you each to respond to your particular question. So Brenda, here's your question. It's very evident in Trace that the visual and plastic arts are principal muses in this collection. Has this always been the case in your work? Could you share with us some of the highlights of this particular love affair with these other artistic practices and how they have enriched your own literary practice? So that's your question. Phuong, your question is the following. It's very evident in A Plucked Zither that memory and migration are two principal muses in your book, but one also detects that there is what I would describe as a subtle undercurrent of trauma. Could you speak a bit about this? And in particular, who were important models for you, if you had them, as you embarked on your own particular journey with these subjects in your own art?
So would you like me to answer first? Sure.
Okay.
I've always had a love affair with visual art for as long as I can remember. And you know, I didn't grow up in a family of artists, but I grew up in a family of folks who were very working class folks who held down jobs. They worked in tanneries and on assembly lines and blast furnaces, and you know, this was truck driving, right? That was what they did for a living, and you couldn't like just go be an artist. That was something very impractical. In fact, my mother, I do have a brother who is a visual artist and another brother who was a musician when he was alive, and my mother would always say, why can't you just be doctors or nurses or, you know, they were the older gen, you know, my parents' generation, the generation before that, they were artisans. So they, I had cousins who rode rodeo and would make the chaps and the saddles. They would tool the leather, and it was incredibly beautiful. It was such a fine skill that they had. I have another cousin who makes furniture, and it's just beautiful furniture, and just, you know, did this out of his garage, right? And so there was a lot of that. They also had a way of, we were always reusing things in our household. So nothing was ever garbage, right? If you were gonna throw out a Folgers coffee can, oh no, you don't throw that out, you decorate it and you turn it into a planter. You know, that when computers first started and they were those giant machines that had punch cards, I remember my father bringing the punch cards home from work, and somehow those punch cards became a big poinsettia wreath at Christmas time. That, you know, my aunt would give us paintbrushes with one hair on them, so that it would take us the whole day to paint them, right? And they would like turn the card and then somehow put it together. So I think, you know, that's the beginning of my love of visual art. And then I just always had an appreciation and found that often I love poetry that I learn from. And so some of my favorite poets are poets that are writing about something I know nothing about, and I would always rather learn about it from poetry than reading a big giant dry history book, for example. So like I've learned all about Guam from the poet Craig Santos Pérez. And so when I'm working with visual art, it's my way of bringing the visual art, right, to people who might be reading poetry but might not otherwise see that visual art. And I don't write solely in response to works by Latino artists, but a lot of the poems I've written have been in response to or in conversation with works by Latino artists. And I also see it as a conversation, right, with the artist. So a collaboration of sorts, whether they're living or not anymore.
We're gonna go from Folgers coffee cans to trauma, so thanks. Yeah, this is a hard question, and I'm sure my answer will be incomplete. Yeah, I appreciate that reading. I think it's there. I think I was thinking about how people tend to think about poetry as healing, and I think we can work with it in that way. And I think I do challenge myself to sit with difficult memories or feelings. And then also I was thinking about how things don't always get resolved, and that sitting with that thing, that feeling, means that you're bringing up something difficult. And so I think in terms of how that plays out into the poem, I'm open to things not being resolved or closed off. And I guess the other question you had was around what kind of models I have. So there's a poem in the book, it's a cento, which also borrows lines from other poets, and they're all, I think they would all identify as migrant writers. So Araceli, Hermé, Monica Stoke, and Javier Zamora. And so, yeah, all migrants of different backgrounds writing about some of those experiences, and then also like historical trauma of for example, Cambodian peoples and their history of genocide. So those are some models for me, and I think they do some of that work too, like lingering with these images that might be hard, but also being okay if that doesn't always get translated as some sort of clear message or contained product at the end.
Thank you very much. Before I turn it over to all of you to ask questions, I want to ask each of our poets to do something for me. Let me preface this little task. So one of my former mentors when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley in the mid-1980s was Robert Pinsky. And he has always maintained, and I concur with him, that a poem is not a fully realized work of art until it is uttered aloud by someone other than its author. In this spirit, I've carefully curated a pair of poems that I'd like to have us gift to our audience at this time. And so I'm going to ask each of you to read a poem. So Brenda, would you gift us the pleasure of hearing Phuong's piece, Mapping Failures in Constant Motion? And Phuong, would you gift us the pleasure of hearing Brenda's piece, Against Insularity? Thank you.
This really is a pleasure to do this. Mapping failures in constant motion. This poem spits in the face of boats, the waves, the thirst that swallowed our torsos, the laws, the conferences, Congress sessions bringing us here. I tear the page to remake me. The poem is my anti-map, all the feelings marked in relation to no one in space. I am motion, so are the landmarks. Time circles, so can my sentences. That's how I'll tell it. In the best scenario, words hurricane, climate weather. I must learn there is no way forward, nowhere to go. Down the interstate of this form. Centripetal stanzas tornado me on a spinning compass. Arrive on the tip of a distant arrow, trued to a never destination, not reached in forward motion. I slant in to the spiraling sun.
Thank you. This is, I think a really cool exercise. Against insularity. Let us push air into our splenetic bubbles until they contain brimming worlds we can plunge into. Blood orange, skies tinged with lavender beyond the horizon. We've never traversed across the line, we've never transgressed. Time to purge our stampeding litanies, pistol-whipped plans, sutured to impossible futures, manacled to metal desks and manicured lawns. Be with me, a forest of deciduous trees, lizard wrinkled, centuries of rings rising to silver-streaked clouds. In our granular wreckage, our tin pan scraps are bursting with viridian tympany. Light the cosmic fire, feed it with lungs the size of ships' bellows, spark celestial candles. They will cluster with amethyst constellations like the lilacs we were born to be.
Questions from the audience?
What? Both of you were incorporating your first or second language into your poems. And I was wondering if you guys have any technique as to when it is the right time to incorporate that other language, Spanish or Vietnamese. Is there a sonic texture that you are listening to, or is there something other than just the sound and more of a content, or, when do you feel comfortable to bring that other language into the poem?
Sometimes it's sonic, it's what you were saying. Sometimes it's that you just, to express it in English, you don't, translation is false, right? Like, we can't really translate anything completely because language is so nuanced. And especially poets were working with those nuances. That's what we're all about. So sometimes to try to say it in English just won't capture it. It's like that wonderful poem of Francisco Aragón's "Un beso is not a kiss." It's just not. It's just not, right? So I think that's the reason sometimes. And then there's just natural places in a sentence where people who speak in what some call Spanglish and some call Inaugural and whatever, there are natural places in a sentence where one switches. There's a whole grammar to it, really, and there's a very old book now called Chicano Discourse, which is about the linguistics of that. I'm forgetting the name of the author right now, but it came out, I think, in the early 90s, maybe even the 80s, but it gives you the grammar of where one who's speaking in Spanglish will switch in a sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's interesting. I think part of it for me is just what resonates, and usually from other creative works. So, for example, the first poem I read was inspired by Safia Al-Hilo, who writes, I want to say in Arabic, I should double check that, but she's of a Sudanese background. And so the ideas are sometimes coming from others who are inspired by them. And I also use some lines, or rather, I'm inspired by some lines from a writer, a Vietnamese writer and songwriter and singer named Jin Kum Sung. And so it's also about like what in those words resonate with me. There's something, whether it's sonic or the meaning of it, that just stays with me. And so I end up playing with that and trying to explore like all the different meanings and just reasons behind that. I think the other thing is, forgetting it now, double meanings. I think that's, really interesting, because sometimes, so Vietnamese words can have multiple meanings, and that's mentioned in the first poem of the Vietnamese word "nước" means water, but it also means country. So what are the meanings behind that, of why that correlates? And recently I was thinking the word "thân" in Vietnamese means close, as in a close friend, but it also means body. So is you're so close to your friend, they're almost your body, or is it that your body is your friend? Like there's so many things that are layered in that. And so I like exploring what that offers us. Yes.
Hey, so I'm thinking this, as I speak, but Brenda, I love your one poem you talk about factory workers and concrete and truck drivers. I have relatives that do truck driving and different warehouse work and that kind of. So I like how you talk about artisans as artists. And then in your Arizona-inspired poem, they come from Deep Shell's Campos. Again, a very oral culture. And La Segunda, I grew up in thrift stores and Mervyn's and Penny's, not Macy's and Nordstrom.
Yeah, right.
So, and your Chas Bojorquez inspired piece, Los de Abajo, I feel that coming through all your work. And so, as a scholar of race and ethnicity and ethnic studies, I always try to foreground to my students that don't forget about class and how does class and race is kind of intertwined and academic jargon, kind of what's the dialectical relationship between race and class. So that's kind of my question. And Phuong, you talk about split screens, which I interpret as two worlds, not colliding, but what's the relationship between those two worlds and exploring distance. So I guess my question is, how do you interpret the role of class and not so much class consciousness in a Marxist term, but more like just kind of economic reality, right? And positionality in academic terms. What's the role of class apart from, or how does that relate to race and ethnicity and culture? Like how does economic and working class Milwaukee and I'm from Sacramento, South Sac is the barrio, black and brown, but Vietnamese as well, so like, they're always right there, riding in school together, and sports, and music, and culture, and restaurants, house class. Do you got the mic? Go.
Yeah, I'll go. Yeah, I think it's definitely there. So that's kind of, I grew up, in East Oakland to be specific. So also around Black and brown folks, and also from like an immigrant or refugee background, that's a different story too. You're not maybe an East Asian person with a higher education degree. You're fleeing from war and trying to have any economic opportunity possible. So that's, kind of what some of the poems are speaking to. And there's like an uncertainty of, how you make your money. I mentioned the poem in which I mentioned my dad's gardening business. That's also tricky. It's not the best work. It's physically demanding. There's in some ways a sense of shame that I felt either from my dad or for my dad. And at the same time, I had a professor, many of the poems come from my MFA thesis, and a professor was like, I'm also uncomfortable with you saying that your dad is also brown, as in the same as undocumented workers he was hiring, because that's also different. So like, how do you also navigate that there are differences even when there's the potential for solidarity in the relationships that are there. So yeah, there are things I'm thinking of is what I'll say.
Before you pass the mic to Brenda, I love that because Mexican Americans, they have like pride and shame in being a gardener or a landscaper. Like, there's honor in that. The dominant culture was down on that.
Yeah, I mean, I have poems that are all about labor, right? And the labor that my family's done, or about, like there's a poem in this book, Close the Door, Don't Touch That. We inherited a home from my aunt, and the home that I was born into, the one I was talking about before, the multi-family house. We inherited that from my aunt and uncle, and my uncle was, he was a skilled laborer. That uncle became an electrician, and he had a workshop. He has this tiny room, this skinny tiny room in the basement that was just filled with all of his tools, and everything was left all in disarray, of course. And I have a poem that's just all about the way I would sit in a high chair when I was a child and in that workshop with him, and he would be, manipulating, using all these different tools, and I was just fascinated in the worlds that it opened up for me, like was as important to me in becoming a writer as, the things I've read. Or I think about how, when I was talking about our kind of Rasquache way of reusing things all the time, he would, his company would send him out on jobs in all different places. And one of the places was called Junior House, and it was a fabric store. And they would be throwing out the remnants, and he would bring home the remnants, right? And my aunt would then make clothes out of these remnants, and they were like, she would make 3-piece suits, right? That were like lined, and that people would think she got them from, these fancy stores. And she would be like, no, I made it. And then she would make clothes for we children too. So my cousin and I were always running around and matching things. But it was all from what was being thrown away, right? And so I think sometimes this becomes my subject matter, right, in my work. But sometimes it's also a matter of language, because we were talking about multilingual or interlingual or translingual work. But for me, it's about more than Spanish and English and a few Nahuatl words or whatever that might come in there. It's also about registers of language, right? So I will use registers of language. I will use words in my work that are very much coming from class. Like you heard me swear multiple times, right, in Spanish. And, sometimes it's in English, sometimes, right? But not just swear words. But the actual language that I grew up around was anything but high elevated speech, right? I think we had one set of encyclopedias in the house that somehow my parents got tricked into buying, right? And that was it. Those were the only books in the house. So I don't ever want my work Now, of course, I'm very privileged as somebody who's read and, become a professor, and I don't ever want my work to lose those registers of language, because that's another kind of internal duality. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Yes, hi. Happy National Poetry Month, by the way.
Thank you.
It seems like I should mention that. Thank you for your poems today. So I ask this question as someone who's not a citizen of the country of poetry. I don't consume a lot of it. So what does it do for you, writing your poetry, putting it out in the world, that prose wouldn't, be it fiction or nonfiction? And how do you come to grips with the fact that a lot of people aren't just going to get it in a way that they would reading an article or reading a short work of fiction or a book? Have at it.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question.
You're welcome.
I think, I know this might, as for someone who might not naturally, but want to sit with a poem, I like that it confuses you. I like that you might have to reread it. I like that you walk away unknowing, and I think that there's opportunities in that if we approach, conversations or politics or each other, like with an understanding that there's slippages in our language, and that what someone is referring to might not mean what you took from that conversation. So that's part of what it offers me. But I think also some of the things that have been brought up in the conversation around sitting with harder feelings or history, engaging with a lineage of like culture. That's one reason why I draw upon the Vietnamese singer-songwriter that I mentioned earlier. So I think it gives me all the space to consider all of that without having to explain myself in a way that reveals everything. So I think I like the mystery, and I think that's something that I can play with, and it feels more creative because I also can hold on to some part of myself.
Yeah, I definitely think that, there are all kinds of experimental novels and things like that, so I don't want to say something that's like a blanket statement, but I think that poetry, there often is this mystery to it. That's one of the things that draws me to it, because we're working in such a condensed form, right? We always talk about the economy of language in poetry and trying to distill it down to as condensed as we can be. And so oftentimes there will be a leap in thought, right? That we are asking the reader to take with us, right? And what is the reward of that? If you read it a few times, you'll start to fill in that gap, right? And there's a beautiful kind of mystery to it. But for me, the other thing that draws me to poetry, and I often tell my undergrad students that are just starting out and writing poems, that as a poet, we are musicians and we are visual artists, because we are trying to make images with words. We want to conjure an image in your mind. When you hear those words together, that string of words together, you can see it, right? It's here for you. So in a sense, we're painting with words. And the other thing, we're musicians because poets, and this is something that I don't know that writers of other genres think about as much or as intensely. We're always thinking about sound, right? How sounds rub up against, there's all these different, like if you were in my poetry class, right, you would learn all these different techniques that we use: alliteration, assonance, consonants, internal rhyme, cross rhyme, slant rhyme, right? All these different techniques that we're using to make an internal music, right, within the line of poetry. That's the other things that draw me to poetry over necessarily writing a novel. I'm thinking about doing creative nonfiction, a book of creative nonfiction essays.
Go for it.
And I have found that fellow poets often are more attracted to creative nonfiction or the lyric essay than to writing fiction. I love to read fiction, but I'm never writing a novel, I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't have the patience, right? And I don't know that I have the imagination, right, for it. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Any questions?
No. One of the descriptions in the flyers talked about navigating multiple identities. And I was wondering if you guys can talk about that in relation to your identities as writers in the poetry community, but also in academia, and also in relation to I guess what you would say, like the mainstream narrative that is attached to your identity, as opposed to your own personal identity, and how you navigate in and out of those when you are in academia, when you are in the poetry community, like right now in this reading, or when you're at home with your parents, and how do you navigate in and out of that, and do you lose, do you gain, how do you balance that, and how does that manifest itself on the page when you come back to your own writing? That's another question, I guess, but take whatever you can.
Okay, I'll try. I was gonna say, what a great audience. These are hard questions. Wow, okay, so navigating, my identity, like ethnically, culturally, but also as a poet in the academy, and then what is that, raise, and also in terms of return to my work. No, I mean, I think I've been thinking a little bit about this too. Like, in some ways, my parents don't care that I'm a poet. It's just not, I think we just don't have the language to talk about it. And I think part of it comes from also my, lack of Vietnamese language ability. But I also think at the end of the day, when I come to them, it's as their child, and they're my parents, and I just want a hug or something like that, or like she's gonna make me some food, which is wonderful, right? That's her expression of love. And I think that, there's opportunities within that too, and then there's also ways that maybe they don't understand the different spaces that I'm in, or the various things that I navigate, like being a poet and being in academia. I think for me, so I'm in the middle of my PhD program, and so we'll see what happens. I think it's the best way to answer your question, because I don't know exactly. I am always trying to make time to continue being a poet, like to continue writing creatively, and also, of course, academia is demanding. We have some professors here, and so what that will look like in the future, how that will shift, how I'll manage, time to do the creative things, we'll see. But I do feel sometimes there's tension just because of how things are split. Although there's like an increasing number, I think, of like creative, critical PhD programs where the two are blended, which I think there's certain pros and cons as well to that. But that's kind of where I'm at, is just trying to navigate what I've been doing and how I can continue that within the demands of academia. But I do think, in terms of your question about what do I bring to the page then, all that navigation, I think in terms of academia, I do feel that, well, one, it's really tough because also then I just think about abstract words, like I just want to say hegemonic like a bunch of times, no one cares, but instead of, describing something in detail and creating that image, but on the other hand, I think engaging with theory helps me to review and reflect on my work. Like, it actually, I'm scared to have some people read this book, because now I'm wondering certain things that I may have, accidentally correlated or, suggested that maybe I didn't mean to. So there's actually a lot of reflection and reward in terms of bringing the critical to the creative too.
Oh, I have lots of different thoughts scattered around. So identity, is for me not just culture, ethnicity, and class, but gender, and there's language, and right, there's so many parts to that intersectionality, right, of who any of us feel that we are. I think I'm usually thinking about that and trying to weave those together, in my work. Academia, I'm retiring next year. And I can't wait. No, I mean, I've been teaching, in one of those PhD programs, a PhD that in creative writing. It's actually in English, but the creative writing, the dissertation is creative. but they write a critical introduction and they go through prelim exams, which is, reading 100 books and, theory and everything else. Certainly I think that informs my thinking and it informs my work. It's sometimes hovering in the background of something, but I also never want to be a poet. And this is just for me, it's not that I don't even enjoy poets who are, but I never want to be a poet that has a book that my mother can't read at all. Certainly there are poems within this book that my mother, and she's already told me, I don't know what you're talking about in that, right? But as long as there are some, right? And I was reading her, she was in the hospital, and after the hospital came to stay with my husband and I for a while, and I was reading her poems out of this book that I thought she would understand and like, and she had tears running down her face and she totally got them, right? And then something else down the way, she'll be like, I don't know what that, okay, that's okay, but there's something there for her, right? There's something that I don't want my work to be transparent, but at the same time, I don't think it always has to be completely unapproachable, right? In order for it to still be nuanced and interesting, if that makes any sense, right? Academe, I've always had that syndrome, what do they call it? Imposter syndrome, my entire life. From the time I went to college as a first-gen student, I was a first-gen student in college, nobody in my whole extended family had gone. And then, of course, graduate school, I was all intimidated by that. And then even today, I'm about to retire, and there are still days when I'm like, they're gonna find me out. I don't belong here. They're gonna find out. I've probably hooded, I don't know, probably 35 doctoral students, and I still go, they're gonna kick me off the stage when I go to the next one because I'm not supposed to be here, right? That's just there, and you just gotta negotiate it and tell it to shut up and go away. Yeah. Is that an answer?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Brenda.
Hi, Alejandra.
So I'm glad that you brought up, in this kind of intersectionality of identity. I appreciate you bringing gender into the conversation. And do you identify as a woman? Yeah, okay, so I can sort of frame my question, I want to. So you're both brown women, right? And you're both brown women that are writing from migrant communities, right? Whether you're first generation like me or second, third generation. How does gender come into your work? I guess that's the first question, but also what kind of interventions do you see brown women poets making? And so, those interventions can be around language, they can be thematic, they can be political, they probably are all of those things. But, so I guess the second part of the question is, what are some of the most important interventions that we see brown women poets making today? Sorry.
Preface, I might not answer and give the perfect answer, and I might want to add more later. I think, in part, I can speak about my own work in terms of interventions. I think of the relationship that I could have had with my grandmother, or even with my mother, if I had more access to Vietnamese. In part, that is due to migration, and then that is in part due to war and imperialism, and right, and so then we can draw this larger list of causality. And so I think that's part of what I'm doing, and I think I'm trying to, in some ways, rebuild or reimagine that relationship with my grandmother, actually, in some of the poems. The last poem is, in some ways, my grandmother speaking. Of course, she's not, here with us, but imagining what she could say, and imagining me speaking back, and then imagining that as one poem. And so that's one kind of intervention, but within that also critiquing that what people tend to think of as the causes of migration. It's usually much more superficial or short term, rather than seeing the longer, more structural critique of migration. feel like there was a question in the beginning that I missed, which is how do I write about gender, I think?
Yeah, or what are your experiences as a Black woman poet?
Yeah. I think in part, in terms of how I write about it, I'm thinking, the word care comes to mind, so exploring like the different ways that care is expressed, you know, and the labor that's behind that. And I think that connects back to class as well, the, you know, additional work that brown women are doing. Yeah, I feel that's gonna be my start to answer your question, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely have some poems that are all about kind of depicting women and many brown women in ways you would not normally see them depicted, right? So you remember Hay una mujer from many years ago, but in that poem, you know, I think I even flipped the script in that poem where it was like the man was having to have the babies and right, and women were riding Broncos and they were right. And so I think there's ways that in a lot of poems I continue to do that, not every poem, but continue to do that to just try to take down the stereotypes, right, of who a woman is, what a woman can do, right, how a woman should talk, you know, exactly like this whole prim and proper thing, right, all of that, kind of trying to destroy that. And I had another thought, because you had mentioned, you know, women of color in general, and books, like I'm thinking of women like Valerie Martinez is a poet who I just really, really love. I love her as a person and as a poet. And I'm thinking about her newest book, Count, which is a book all of eco poetry, where, you know, she as a woman is taking a lead in saying, you know, in this book that's all about water and saying, you know, we need to do something about this, and writing about ways in which other women have come together and been at the fore of leading movements around climate change, right? So that's in that book as well. So I think recognizing the, as you said, the care work women do, and I certainly feel that, because you know, as I mentioned, I went through a year and a half of nothing but deaths, and I was the one that was always the caregiver, right? And it's like, you're like, where are you to the men? Like, what, you know, like, why is this happening? But also around the activist work that women do, right? And just like I might want to write a poem about a painting or a sculpture that I might want to bring to you, I might write a poem about, you know, activist women and a movement they've started or work that they've done in order to say, hey, look at these women are there doing that. I don't know if that's helping. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but this has been a really efficient conversation. Please buy some books if you want. There's some refreshments in the back. And thank you for joining us. Are we on?